As we look at the rock music timeline overview of the 90s, we can see some of the artists that we've been talking about here in the top selling artists, as well as some artists that have been existing in the 80s. We still have Michael Jackson on here and Red Hot Chili Peppers. But we have a lot of these grunge artists, the Smashing Pumpkins, which I hadn't included over here. We have No Doubt that we had talked about. We have Pearl Jam here. Nirvana, obviously. Radiohead is another kind of post-grunge band. And Green Day is going to emerge probably as the longest standing alternative punk or alternative rock artists. There's a whole bunch of small record labels, right, going on in the early 1990s, and that's part of what this rebellion is. They're rebelling against those big 5 or 6 record labels that have been there. Now, those record labels are going to figure it out. They're going to start to pretend like they're smaller record labels. But interestingly, that movement towards those new record labels was about the same time as we saw that movement in other areas of life, such as beer. There started to be a whole bunch of small breweries coming up in towns where people would go. Coffee, things like Starbucks, what people felt were more intimate. Bookstores, which grew into huge ones like Barnes & Nobles. And even food, where the idea was you would buy, instead of Wonder Bread, you would be buying some sort of homemade bread. Some of those ideals that were born in the late 60s started to come into fruition here, where we wanted a more intimate, personal, and less produced experience. And that's the idea of alternative. All these artists, as different as they might sound at first blush, the idea is that they are not commercialized. They are taking on demand, and they are taking on the commercial powers that be, even as they get large paychecks for doing so. You'll see the rock music timeline breaks it into some of the genres we talk about, the alternative, the grunge, the pop punk. There's some British, but I would say this was, of all the decades, the least amount of British influence. There starts to emerge a lot of new pop bands at the time. The decade will end with Britney Spears. We'll have the emergence of those singer-songwriters I was talking about. Alanis Morissette. I didn't include some of these other ones, but they were very important. And then the new metal, industrial metal sounds of Nine Inch Nails, Limp Bizkit, and that sort of thing. Meanwhile, hip-hop and rock will go their separate ways for the most part, and hip-hop will eventually be surpassing rock in the next 20 years. Just touch through these artists and the bands I'd like you to know. So Nine Inch Nails is important because they were really the first new or industrial metal band, coming out with, even in the late 80s, songs that were fairly edgy, right? A harsher tone than traditional metal. Really here, come in 1991, you'll see that we have these big 4 grunge bands emerge, and these are the people that are going to say, hey, it's okay to be alternative. We don't have to be like Whitesnake or Motley Crue anymore. The music can be about us. And each one of these bands is going to have a somewhat tortured relationship with its popularity. All 4 of these bands have been very touched by suicide, depression, and heroin overdose. So similar to the late 60s in that way. The band that really made this alternative scene come to life was Nirvana, and their song Smells Like Teen Spirit was the most transformative song of the decade. So that's one you need to know. I'd like you to listen to Lithium as well and know that song just to get a feel for what Nirvana could do. Listen in that song for those really extreme changes between loud and quiet. That was very new and radical at the time. And then how the lyrics are suddenly nonsensical. They don't mean anything, and they don't want to mean anything. They don't try to mean anything. They're very anti-establishment in the way their lyrics are both sung and written. If you watch the video, it's a parody of the 1980s cheesy videos where they're having a high school rally, and yet it's all dark. You'll notice in that video it looks a lot more like the Cure video where there's a lot of shadows and gritty sounds, and the janitor is part of the video and that sort of thing. So the idea is that they're turning that 1980s sentiment on its head. Alice in Chains is a band whose popularity hasn't withstood the test of time as well as Nirvana, which is unfortunate. One of the things that they did a very good job of was bringing that traditional heavy metal sound into the mainstream. And you'll hear a lot of Black Sabbath influence in their music, slow, trudging sounds and lyrics. And in addition, you're going to hear some of the incredible singing in that band. And that's one of the other things about these bands is the musicianship is going to be very powerful. There's going to be some excellent drummers, singers, and guitarists, more so than we had heard for quite a while, probably since the late 1960s in a lot of ways. And so Lane Staley was probably one of the better singers in rock and roll, although he did die from heroin overdose in 2002. So I'd like you to know the song Rooster, and if you want to listen to Man in the Box, you will hear kind of that bridge between what had been glam metal into this grunge sound. Pearl Jam is another really important one of these bands, and probably, interestingly enough, all the bands that were mimicked after the grunge scene, Pearl Jam is probably mimicked more than anyone. And what you'll start to hear in Pearl Jam and also in Alice in Chains is kind of this growling, throaty sound when they sing, and that sound's going to be mimicked by most of rock and roll bands from thereafter. They're going to kind of want this deeper, heavier sound than we had when we had Robert Plant and Led Zeppelin singing really high and screaming. Okay, so we're going to end up with this lower, what's called baritone voice, which is in between the tenor and bass voices. And that baritone, deeper, richer voice is going to be important all the way through the end of Rockin'. Soundgarden I've included. They did not reach the same levels of popularity as Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, and Nirvana, but they were one of the first grunge bands to sign with a major label. And also, the lead singer, Chris Cornell, had a lot of influence on other bands and continued his career with Audioslave for many years before he committed suicide. You'll hear in Soundgarden a sound more similar to Nine Inch Nails and this industrial metal than in some of the other grunge, and even a lot of influence of Metallica in their sounds. Another one of the more amazing singers in rock and roll. I would say that singer for Soundgarden and Alice in Chains are probably 4 or 5 best male rock singers in rock and roll. Probably 2 of them are in these 2 bands. The reason these bands are able to make it big is they're able to take that punk sentiment, the weight of heavy metal, and the lyrical approach of alternative, and make it palpable to the mainstream by creating songs that are somewhat catchy. Like if you listen to Smells Like Teen Spirit or many of these songs, The Man in the Box, The Rooster, the melodies are very catchy, almost like the Beatles, and very melodic, but it's over the top of this very heavy, trudgy sound. And we haven't heard melodic music like that for quite a while. Most of the music we'd been hearing in the 80s was kind of anthematic, meaning a lot of notes were just repeated, but not as melodic. And that was a very strange combination, but it's what made this music palpable. It had a very simple song form. The melodies were catchy, even though the presentation was very complex. So when that burst on the scene in 1992, everybody wants to be alternative. Glam metal and pop rock basically disappear. There's 3 or 4 bands that are able to stand this transition, but probably more bands go out of business in the early 90s than any other period. And we're left with other artists who play to that anti-establishment or alternative sentiment. And one of the other areas I talked to you about was the idea of the singer-songwriter. And here we have Sheryl Crow and Alanis Morissette, 2 of the biggest female-selling artists of all time. And their music borderlines between pop and rock, but because it is primarily guitar-centric, they write their own songs, and their music generally has topics that are a bit edgy, like if it makes you happy, why the hell are you so sad? Or isn't it ironic? That I lobby that they are more rock and roll than they are pop. There are many other female singer-songwriters that burst onto the scene right around 1994. The female singer-songwriter genre becomes one of the largest genres of the 1990s and the 2000s. There's probably 15 to 20 artists that come out, and some of the artists that we listen to today, even though they're more pop, still fit into that genre. Another band that benefited from the acceptance of alternative music was No Doubt, which was less grungy and more pop and ska oriented with a bit of a reggae impersonation. They didn't sell a lot of records in the 90s, but they did get a lot of airplay. Don't Speak is a song you recognize. You'll hear that song is fairly pop. They're bridging the line into pop. But No Doubt managed to maintain just enough of the artist, songwriter, anti-establishment perspective that we're going to consider them rock. Green Day and Sublime had been around since the 80s, but again, they weren't accepted in the mainstream until after the grunge scene, so it wasn't until 95 and 96 when their songs, When I Come Around and What I Got, become, I think both of those went to number 1. Bring that idea of the alternative punk into pop mainstream. And Green Day has obviously continued to go on to be one of the biggest selling of our artists all time. Meanwhile, Sublime, the lead singer, died from a heroin overdose. True to the nature of the grunge and alternative music movement in the early 90s. Phish is a band I'd like you to know and listen to, and again, they're similar to the Grateful Dead. They're going to be one of those jam bands. Again, the idea is, as long as it's not mainstream commercial, heck, let's give it a try. That's what all these genres have in common. And so Phish is going to pick up where Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead left off after 30 years. Phish is now the main touring band.